So again, blood tests can be inaccurate, biopsy can be extremely misleading, saliva tests can be inaccurate. So what's a person to do? How does a person know whether or not gluten sensitivity is an issue? That brings us to genetic testing. Now, why does that bring us to genetic testing? It brings us to genetic testing. Now, genetic testing doesn't really identify a disease state. A lot of people are confused. A lot of people think that gluten sensitivity is a disease. Gluten sensitivity is not a disease. Gluten sensitivity is a state of genetics, meaning you have the genes or you don't. And if you have the genes and you eat gluten, what ends up happening is your immune system will view that gluten as an enemy, and it'll create an inflammatory response. And that inflammatory response over time can create damage to your small intestine, but also damage systemically to other tissues in your body. So the best way, and actually it's interesting, is back, I think it was back in 2012, we've been doing genetic testing for gluten sensitivity now going on close to 20 years. But the Mayo Clinic in 2012 announced that this particular type of testing should be the new gold standard, HLA-DQ testing. So why do we want to do HLA-DQ testing? Let me draw you another picture and just make it help you understand a little bit better. When we're looking at the cells, the surface of the cells have a receptor, and this is a very rudimentary drawing, but so this is a cell, immune cell, and then this is what's called an HLA-DQ antenna or receptor. I'll spell out receptor for you. And so what this receptor does, it's on the surface of your immune cells, and what this receptor does is it helps to identify things in the body that don't belong. So this receptor is kind of like the guardian, if you will. It looks at things and it says, that doesn't look like a healthy thing for the body to get exposed to, and it grabs onto it. And so there are certain genetic patterns. This receptor is produced as a result of two genes. They're called HLA-DQ genes. We have an alpha-1 and we have a beta-1 gene. And so what happens if you have a gluten-sensitive gene pattern is gluten, let's call this gluten right here, gluten will bind to that antenna or bind to that receptor, and that will create an immune response. And that immune response generally leads to inflammation. Now, you get exposure once or twice here or there, not a big deal, but if you get exposure on a regular basis, we get what's called chronic inflammation. And that's what many of these autoimmune diseases are. They're diseases of chronic inflammation. The body is being exposed repetitively to something it perceives to be a poison over time, creating more and more inflammation. Well, that inflammation builds and builds and builds until the body can no longer continue to put out the fire. And that's when the symptoms and the other types of diseases really can start to set in. So when we say that gluten sensitivity is a state of genetics, it's very, very true in that many people can develop disease as a result of gluten exposure, but gluten sensitivity itself is not a disease. It's the exposure that creates the chronic inflammation that leads to the disease. So that's why we want to know what the genetics look like, because if we have a picture or an idea of what the genes look like, then instead of trying to hunt down different diseases, right, we can hunt down the genetic receptors. And if it's right for a person to go on a gluten-free diet, if it's the right move for them to make, that advice can be given and that advice can be adhered to. Now, some people would say, well, Dr. Osborne, you left out the most important test for identifying gluten sensitivity. What about the elimination diet? Let's see here. Let's write it down here. So, why can't I just do an elimination diet to see whether or not gluten is bothering me? Here's why. I mean, you can do an elimination diet, and some people do, and they feel better, but here's what an elimination diet won't tell you. Understand, some people feel better. If you haven't read my book, No Grain, No Pain, I talk about a lot of these different concepts in the book, but some people feel better when they cut grain out of their diet. And one of the reasons that you can feel better when you cut grain out of the diet is because you're cutting gluten out of the diet. So certainly one of the reasons is gluten. One of the reasons, though, because grain is oftentimes contaminated with mycotoxin, which is mold poison, mold toxins. Grains can also be contaminated with molds, and many people are allergic to molds. Processed breads oftentimes contain bromine, which is a dough conditioner that some people react to. We also have other substances that grain is processed with. One in particular, oftentimes referred to as meat glue. Its actual scientific name is microbial transglutaminase. Oftentimes your bread products are basically treated with meat glue, and that can make them act like gluten, even if they're gluten-free products. So like, for example, dairy can be treated with meat glue, and people with gluten sensitivity can react to the dairy as a result of the meat glue exposure. But again, meat glue can also be found in grains, and so you may be reacting to these things in the grains, but that's not all. We've got other things in grain as well, like pesticide. Particularly, many of you have asked me here in the past about things like glyphosate, about the Roundup, right? Which a jury trial in California just convicted the company responsible for producing Roundup for causing a man's lymphoma, which is a type of intestinal cancer. And so pesticides like glyphosate and other forms of pesticide, when you're eating grain-based foods or gluten-based foods, oftentimes these will contain those as well. Some of your grain-based foods are GMO, genetically modified. So we've got GMO as an issue. And some of them have additional food additives or preservatives or dyes. And of course, cutting them out, you might feel better. So and this is just a handful of reasons. There are many more than this, but this is an example of, if you do an elimination diet and you feel better, how do you know you're feeling better? Because of gluten, because of this, because of mold, because of meat glue, because of pesticides or GMO or food additives or bromine or whatever it is. How do you know which one it is? And the bottom line is it's hard to know. It's hard to know because it's hard to get grain that doesn't have one or more of these different components. Yes, you could buy organic grain, but that doesn't mean that it's not contaminated with mold or mycotoxin. Organic grain can still be contaminated. So again, if you are doing an elimination diet, you can't be sure whether or not if you feel better, that you're actually gluten sensitive because you feel better, or whether it was some of these other things. Or it could be gluten and some of these other things, so it can get complex. And this goes back to why I recommend genetic testing. Because if you know that you should avoid gluten, and you know it's genetic in nature that if you eat gluten, your body perceives gluten to be an enemy, then you can take a proactive diet approach and change your diet. Versus not knowing and trying gluten-free out. And what happens when most people try gluten-free out is they don't go on a gluten-free diet, they go on a modified gluten-free diet, or what I call a traditional gluten-free diet, where they're avoiding wheat, barley, and rye, but they're not avoiding the other grains that also contain glutens and other problematic issues. Another scenario, some people don't go on a no-gluten diet, they go on a low gluten diet. So they've reduced the quantity of gluten exposure, but they haven't eliminated it, and not knowing because they're not taking it seriously enough because they haven't been properly educated. Gluten can cause damage at 20 parts per million. So that's not a very, very heavy dose. It can cause an inflammatory response for up to 2 months. So if you're trying to overcome a chronic autoimmune inflammatory problem, and you don't even know whether or not you're gluten sensitive, and you're not taking the diet seriously enough, you may never ever overcome that illness because you get enough exposure consistently enough over time to continue to contribute to that chronic inflammation and to that illness, as it were. So again, here's your rough basic breakdown. I tried to simplify it for you and make it as easy to understand as possible. Hey, and if you missed the earlier part of this series, click right here so you can go back and get caught up. The information there might be critical to helping you on your path to better health. And as always, thanks for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe for updates below. Have a great day.